The champagne flute trembled in my grip as I stared at the handwritten place card tucked between two folding chairs near the kitchen service entrance. Natalie Romano, table 47, not table 1 with the immediate family, not table 5 with the wedding party. Table 47, positioned so close to the swinging doors that I could smell the garlic from the catering prep and feel the rush of air every time a server hurried past with another tray of hors d'oeuvres. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Natalie Romano. I'm 34 years old, and this is the story of how a seating arrangement at my own brother's wedding became the moment that changed everything. How being treated like hired help led to a revelation that shook an entire ballroom full of California's elite, and how sometimes the person you overlook is exactly the one you should have been honoring all along. The Ashford estate stretched across 300 acres of pristine Napa Valley vineyard, its manicured gardens and limestone architecture screaming old money in every perfectly placed detail. Crystal chandeliers hung from hand-carved ceilings, and servers in crisp white uniforms glided between guests carrying silver trays of champagne that probably cost more per bottle than I made in a week at the Veterans Clinic where I worked. I smoothed down the simple navy dress I'd bought off the rack at Macy's, suddenly hyper-aware of how it paled in comparison to the designer gowns floating around me like expensive clouds. The other guests wore their wealth like armor, Hermes handbags, Louboutin heels, jewelry that caught the light and threw it back in rainbow prisms. Meanwhile, I clutched my Target purse and tried not to feel like an imposter at my own brother's wedding. Derek looked magnificent in his black tuxedo, his face glowing with happiness as he shook hands with Victoria's father near the altar. My little brother, the one I'd helped raise after our parents died in that car accident when he was 16. The same Derek who used to practice his wedding vows on me while I helped him with college applications, never imagining he'd end up marrying into one of Napa Valley's most prominent family. Victoria Ashford was everything Derek deserved, beautiful, intelligent, kind-hearted despite her privileged upbringing. When he'd first brought her home to our cramped apartment 2 years ago, she'd sat on our second-hand couch eating leftover pizza and laughing at Derek's terrible jokes like she belonged there. I'd loved her immediately, which made the current situation that much more painful. Because while Victoria might accept me, her mother Margaret Ashford was an entirely different story. Margaret swept through the cocktail hour like a general inspecting troops, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her emerald dress probably costing more than my monthly rent. She air-kissed the society wives, exchanged business cards with prominent donors, and made sure every detail of her daughter's wedding was photographed for the social pages. When her eyes landed on me, they'd slide past like I was part of the furniture. I tried to approach her during the rehearsal dinner the night before, hoping to break the ice. "Mrs. Ashford, thank you so much for welcoming Derek into your family. This wedding is absolutely beautiful." She'd smiled the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. "Oh yes, Natalie, isn't the sister? How nice that you could make it." Her gaze had swept over my department store dress and sensible heels before she'd excused herself to greet someone more important. Now, standing beside table 47, I understood the message loud and clear. I was Derek's family by blood, which meant I had to be invited, but I wasn't their kind of family. I wasn't Napa Valley elite or San Francisco society. I was just the working-class sister who'd raised Derek on food stamps and government assistance after our parents' death. I was the reminder of where he'd come from, something to be tucked away in the corner where the important guests wouldn't have to acknowledge my existence. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent the last 15 years making sure Derek could reach for dreams that seemed impossible for kids like us. I'd worked 3 jobs to help pay for his college tuition. I'd sacrificed my own education plans so he could attend Stanford. I'd celebrated every achievement, every promotion, every step that took him further from the poverty we'd grown up in. And now that he'd arrived at the pinnacle of success, marrying into wealth and privilege, I was the embarrassing relative to be hidden away. "Excuse me, miss." A server in a bow tie tapped my shoulder. "You're blocking the service entrance. Could you please take your seat?" Heat flooded my cheeks as I realized I'd been standing there lost in thought while catering staff tried to navigate around me. "Of course I'm sorry." I settled into the folding chair, not even the elegant Chiavari chairs that graced the other tables, but basic rental furniture that wobbled when I shifted my weight. My table mates were a collection of +1s and distant relatives, people who'd clearly drawn the short straw in the seating arrangement lottery. To my left sat an elderly man who kept checking his watch and muttering about missing his bridge game. To my right, a young woman scrolled through her phone, completely disinterested in making conversation. From my vantage point near the kitchen, I had a perfect view of the head table where Derek and Victoria sat surrounded by the wedding party, all perfectly coiffed, all laughing at jokes I couldn't hear over the clatter of dishes being cleared. Margaret held court at table 2, regaling guests with stories about the vineyard's history and the wedding's featured wine pairings. Table 3 hosted Victoria's college friends, successful professionals who'd probably never set foot in a Target in their lives. The dinner service began with a flourish. Servers emerged from the kitchen, carrying plates of seared duck breast with pomegranate reduction, their movements choreographed like a ballet. The head table was served first, of course, followed by tables 2 through 10 in descending order of importance. By the time our server reached table 47, the duck was slightly cold and the vegetables had lost their vibrant color. "Sorry about the wait," the young server whispered apologetically. Kitchen got backed up. I smiled at him, recognizing the exhaustion behind his professional demeanor. I'd worked enough service jobs during Derek's college years to understand the pressure of a high-end event. "No worries, you're doing great." He looked surprised by the kindness, straightening his shoulders slightly before moving on to the next table. It was a small interaction, but it reminded me of something I'd almost forgotten in the midst of feeling sorry for myself. I knew what it was like to work hard for recognition that never came. I understood the weight of being invisible to people who considered themselves important. The irony was that Margaret Ashford had no idea who she was dismissing. She'd done her research on Derek, of course, his Stanford degree, his successful tech career, his bright future, but she'd never bothered to look deeper into his background, never asked about the sister who'd made it all possible. She saw me as an embarrassment, a reminder of Derek's humble beginnings that she'd prefer to forget. If she'd bothered to ask, she might have learned that the woman she'd seated by the kitchen had once commanded the respect of generals, that the simple navy dress covered scars from roadside bombs in Afghanistan, that the hands now picking at overpriced wedding cake had once saved lives in field hospitals where every second counted and failure meant watching good soldiers die. But Margaret Ashford lived in a world where worth was measured by net worth, where value came from vineyard acreage and social connections. She couldn't see past the surface to understand that some people earned their place at the table through sacrifice rather than inheritance. The speeches began as dessert was served. Derek's best man told embarrassing college stories that had the head table in stitches. Victoria's maid of honor shared touching memories of their friendship, complete with a slideshow of their adventures in Europe and the Hamptons. Each story painted a picture of lives lived in comfort and privilege, surrounded by opportunities that seemed as natural as breathing. Then Derek stood to thank his guests, his voice warm with emotion as he spoke about finding love and building a future with Victoria. His words were beautiful and heartfelt, and I felt proud watching him command the room with confidence I remembered him lacking as a scared teenager. "I also want to thank the people who helped me become the man I am today," Derek continued, and for a moment, my heart lifted. This was when he'd acknowledged the sacrifices, the late nights working multiple jobs, the way we'd scraped together enough money for his college applications. Victoria's parents, Richard and Margaret, have welcomed me into their family with open arms. Their generosity and guidance mean the world to me. The applause was thunderous. Margaret practically glowed with pride, dabbing at her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. Richard raised his champagne flute in acknowledgement, basking in the recognition of his paternal role in Derek's success. Derek continued thanking professors, mentors, colleagues and friends. Each acknowledgement met with warm applause and knowing smiles from the audience. The speech was lovely, gracious and perfectly calibrated for his new social circle. What it wasn't was on. There was no mention of our parents who'd died too young, no acknowledgement of the sister who'd worked herself to exhaustion to pay for his dreams, no recognition of the woman who'd put her own life on hold so he could build. I wasn't asking for a medal or a standing ovation, but a simple thank you to my sister Natalie would have meant everything. Instead, I sat at table 47, invisible and forgotten, watching my brother rewrite our history to fit his new reality. The woman who'd raised him had become a detail too uncomfortable to acknowledge in front of his new family. The dance floor opened after the speeches, and couples swayed to the soft jazz of the hired quartet. Derek and Victoria's first dance was picture perfect, surrounded by photographers capturing every moment for the society pages. Margaret danced with Richard, then with Derek, her face radiant with the joy of a mother watching her daughter marry well. I remained seated, nursing my wine and trying to process the strange grief of being erased from someone's story while sitting in the same room with them. This wasn't how I'd imagined my brother's wedding. I'd pictured myself at the family table, maybe giving a speech about watching Derek grow up, sharing funny stories about his childhood dreams and teenage awkwardness. Instead, I was a spectator at an event celebrating a version of Derek's life that didn't include me. "Beautiful wedding," commented the elderly man to my left, making his first attempt at conversation all evening. "Yes," I agreed. "Derek looks happy." "The groom? You know him?" The question hit me like a physical blow. We'd been sitting at the same table for 3 hours, and this man hadn't realized I was related to the groom. The seating arrangement had been so effective at communicating my irrelevance that even my table mates assumed I was just another random guest. "He's my brother," I said quietly. The man looked genuinely surprised. "Your brother? But you're sitting." He gestured around our corner table, confusion clear on his face. "I know where I'm sitting." The conversation died there, but the damage was done. The reality of my situation had been laid bare by a stranger's innocent observation. The bride's family had successfully communicated my place in Derek's new world, and that place was nowhere near the center of his story. I excused myself and walked toward the ladies' room, needing a moment to collect myself before I did something embarrassing like cry at my own brother's wedding. The hallway was lined with family photos, generations of Ashfords captured in silver frames, their accomplishments documented in brass plaques below each image. Military commendations.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Business achievements, philanthropic awards, academic honor. This was a family that valued service and sacrifice, achievement and honor, which made Margaret's treatment of me even more baffling. If she'd bothered to learn my story, she might have found we had more in common than she realized. But she'd made her judgment based on my address, my clothes, and my lack of social connections, never looking deeper to see what I'd actually accomplished or sacrificed. Standing in that hallway, surrounded by images of honor and service, I made a decision. I wasn't going to slink away from my brother's wedding like some embarrassing secret. I wasn't going to let Margaret Ashford's social prejudices rob me of the right to celebrate Derek's happiness, and I definitely wasn't going to let her ignorance define my worth. I'd spent too many years in situations where life and death decisions were made in seconds, where leadership meant stepping up regardless of who was watching or what they thought of you. I'd earned my place at tables far more important than this one, even if the people here were too narrow-minded to recognize it. It was time to remind everyone that respect isn't always about who you know or where you come from. Sometimes it's about who you are when it matters. Sometimes it's about the battles you've fought that no one else can see. And sometimes, just sometimes, the person you dismiss as unimportant turns out to be exactly the person you should have been honoring all along. The real story was about to begin, and Margaret Ashford was about to learn that seating someone by the kitchen doesn't make them kitchen help. It just gives them a better view of everything that's about to unfold. When I returned to the reception, the band had switched to more upbeat music and the dance floor was filling with couples. I walked back toward table 47 with renewed purpose, my spine straighter and my chin higher than when I'd left. The elderly man was gone, probably having escaped to his bridge game, and the young woman was now slow dancing with someone who'd clearly had too much champagne. I stood behind my chair, surveying the scene with different eyes now. Instead of seeing my exclusion, I started noticing things I'd missed before. The way the servers moved with military precision, their coordination speaking to hours of training and preparation. The security personnel positioned discreetly around the perimeter, their posture and watchfulness indicating professional backgrounds. The older gentleman at table 12, whose ramrod straight posture and precise movements screamed career military, even in his expensive civilian suit. These details had been invisible to me earlier when I was drowning in self-pity, but now they painted a different picture. This wasn't just a gathering of wine country elite and tech industry professionals. There were people here with stories that went deeper than stock portfolios and vineyard holdings. "Mind if I join you?" I turned to find a woman about my age approaching. Her auburn hair swept into an elegant chignon and her emerald dress clearly expensive but understated. What caught my attention wasn't her appearance though. It was the way she carried herself, alert and confident in a way that reminded me of someone. "Please," I gestured to the empty chair beside me. "I'm Natalie." "Captain Lisa Chen," she said, extending her hand with a firm grip that confirmed my suspicions. "Well, former captain, these days I'm just Lisa, management consultant and apparently wedding crasher." I couldn't help but smile. Wedding crasher? Long story. I was supposed to be Victoria's +1 for a college friend's wedding next month, but she got her dates mixed up and invited me to this one instead. By the time we figured out the confusion, she insisted I stay, something about meeting interesting people. Lisa glanced around the opulent ballroom. Though I have to say, Most of the conversation so far has been about wine vintages and stock options. Not your usual topics. Lisa laughed, a genuine sound that cut through the polite wedding chatter around us. Let's just say my last assignment involved dodging mortars in Syria, not discussing market volatility in Sonoma County. The casual way she mentioned Syria sent a jolt of recognition through me. I studied her face more carefully, noting the slight scar above her left eyebrow and the way her eyes constantly scanned the room even while we talked. This was someone who understood threat assessment, who'd learned to stay alert even at social gatherings. Military? I asked quietly. Army intelligence, 3 tours overseas. You? Medic, 2 tours Afghanistan, 1 Iraq. The atmosphere between us shifted immediately. Lisa's posture relaxed slightly, the way it does when you find someone who speaks the same unspoken language. We didn't need to exchange unit numbers or compare deployment stories. The recognition was enough. So what brings a former combat medic to Napa Valley's social event of the season? Lisa asked, settling back in her chair like she was genuinely interested in the answer. The groom is my brother. Lisa's eyebrows rose. Derek? Really? She glanced toward the head table where Derek was laughing with Victoria's cousins. He seems like a good guy. Victoria adores him. He is a good guy, I said, meaning it despite everything. He's just navigating some complicated family dynamic. Ah, Lisa's gaze moved to our table number, then back to the head table, and I could see her putting the pieces together. Hence the premium seating by the kitchen. The bride's mother has very specific ideas about appropriate social hierarchies. Margaret Ashford, Lisa said with understanding. I met her during cocktails. She spent 10 minutes telling me about her daughter's accomplishments and another 5 explaining why the wedding planner's first 3 menu suggestions weren't suitable for people of their caliber. Lisa made air quotes around the last phrase. Sounds about right. What she doesn't know, Lisa continued, is that while she was lecturing me about wine pairings, I was calculating sightlines and exit strategies. Old habits. I found myself laughing for the first time all evening. You were doing tactical assessment at a wedding reception, force of habit. Plus, some of these guests are carrying enough jewelry to fund a small country's defense budget. The security implications alone are fascinating. Our conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the head table. A distinguished older gentleman had approached Derek and Victoria, and even from our distance I could see the immediate change in posture of everyone around him. Conversations quieted, people straightened their shoulders, and a subtle but unmistakable deference rippled through the nearby table. Lisa followed my gaze and whistled softly. Well, I'll be damned. You know him. That's General Harrison Knox. 4-star general, recently retired. He was commanding officer for the entire Middle Eastern theater during my second deployment. Lisa's voice carried a note of respect that hadn't been there when she'd mentioned Margaret Ashford. He's a legend. What the hell is he doing at a tech executive's wedding in Napa Valley? I watched as the general shook Derek's hand, his bearing unmistakably military even in his formal civilian attire. Derek looked slightly overwhelmed, clearly recognizing the man's importance without fully understanding who he was. Victoria was introducing him to her parents, and Margaret's face had transformed into the kind of radiant smile usually reserved for major donors or celebrities. Probably a family connection, I suggested. The Ashfords seemed to know everyone important in Northern California. Maybe, Lisa said, but she sounded doubtful. Though Knox isn't the country club type, he's career military, grew up on a ranch in Montana. Not exactly Margaret Ashford's usual social circle. The general had moved on from the head table and was now making his way through the reception, stopping to speak with various guests. His progression was interesting to watch. He bypassed several tables of obvious VIPs and instead seemed drawn to the older gentleman I'd noticed earlier, the one with military bearing. They embraced like old friends, their conversation animated and comfortable. He's working the room, Lisa observed, but not the way politicians do. He's looking for specific people. What kind of specific people? Veterans, I guess. Knox was famous for knowing his people, remembering faces and stories even years later. If there are former military at this wedding, he'll find them. As if summoned by our conversation, General Knox's path through the reception brought him closer to our corner of the ballroom. I found myself sitting straighter, an automatic response to the presence of senior leadership that no amount of civilian life could completely erase. Captain Chen, the general said, appearing beside our table with the kind of quiet authority that commanded immediate attention. I thought that was you. How are you adjusting to civilian life? Lisa stood immediately, her response automatic and respectful.
General Knox, sir.
It's good to see you. Civilian life has its challenges, but I'm finding my way. I'm sure you are. Your work in Damascus was exemplary. He turned to me with the same focused attention. And you are? I stood as well, my military training overriding the social awkwardness of the evening. Natalie Romano, sir. Former Staff Sergeant, Army Medical Corps. Something shifted in the general's expression as he studied my face. Romano, where did you serve, Sergeant? Kandahar Province, sir. Forward Operating Base, Chapman, then later at the field hospital in Helmand. The general's eyes sharpened with recognition, and I saw Lisa glance between us with growing curiosity. What years? 2018 to 20. General Knox was quiet for a moment, his gaze never leaving my face. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that made several nearby conversations pause. You're the medic who held Chapman's field hospital together during the siege in October 20. It wasn't a question. The siege of Chapman had lasted 6 days, with constant incoming fire and medical emergencies that pushed our small team beyond every limit we thought we had. I'd worked 48 hours straight, performing surgeries I wasn't technically qualified for while rockets exploded outside the medical tent. 12 soldiers had been evacuated to Germany under my care. All 12 had survived. I was part of the team, sir. You were the team, Sergeant. I read every after-action report from that week. His voice grew quieter but somehow more intense. Captain Martinez recommended you for the Silver Star. The paperwork got lost in the transition between commands, but I remember the citation. Extraordinary heroism under fire, saving lives at significant personal risk, maintaining medical operations under extreme duress. The ballroom around us seemed to fade away. Lisa had gone completely still beside me, her expression shifting from curiosity to something approaching awe. I was dimly aware that other conversations had stopped, that people were turning to listen, but my focus remained locked on General Knox. The Silver Star recommendation was resubmitted through different channels, he continued. It was approved and awarded posthumously to Captain Martinez after he was killed in action 2 months later, but the original recommendation was for 2 recipients, not 1. My heart stopped. Captain Martinez had died in a convoy attack in December 2019, just weeks after recommending me for the medal. I'd attended his memorial service, grieving not just the loss of a good officer but the mentor who'd helped me become the medic I was. I'd never known about the Silver Star recommendation, had never heard that my name had been connected to his. Sir, I was never notified about any medal recommendation, because the paperwork disappeared into the bureaucratic void after Martinez's death. These things happen more often than they should, especially with field decorations during active operations. General Knox's expression was grim. It's taken 3 years and a formal review to untangle the records and confirm what should have been processed immediately. I felt Lisa's hand touch my arm, steadying me as the implications of the general's words sank in. Around us, the wedding reception continued, but it felt distant and surreal, like watching a movie of someone else's life. Sergeant Romano, General Knox said formally, his voice carrying across the immediate area and causing more guests to turn in our direction. By the authority vested in me by the United States Army and on behalf of a grateful nation, it is my honor to inform you that you have been awarded the Silver Star for gallantry in action. The silence that followed was complete. Even the band seemed to sense something significant was happening, and let their current song fade to nothing. I stood frozen, unable to process what I'd just heard. The formal ceremony will take place at the Pentagon next month. The general continued, but I wanted you to know tonight. Captain Martinez's recommendation finally found its way to the right desk, along with testimony from the 11 soldiers whose lives you saved during the siege. 11? I whispered. Sir, there were 12 evacuations. General Knox's expression softened slightly. The 12th soldier was Captain Martinez himself. He was wounded during the final rocket attack while helping you evacuate the last casualty. You performed emergency surgery on your commanding officer under fire, then supervised his evacuation before treating 3 more wounded soldiers who came in during the final barrage. The memories came flooding back. Martinez collapsing from shrapnel wounds, blood everywhere, my hands shaking as I worked on someone who'd become more than a superior officer. He'd been conscious, trying to give me orders even while I was cutting into his chest to stop internal bleeding. He survived because of your skill and courage, Sergeant. He lived long enough to write that recommendation, to make sure your heroism was documented. General Knox's voice was steady, professional, but I could hear the emotion underneath. That's why it was so important to him. He knew what you'd done, what you'd sacrificed, and he wanted to make sure the Army knew it too. I realized I was crying, tears streaming down my face in the middle of my brother's wedding reception. Lisa's hand was still on my arm, anchoring me to the present moment. Around us, the other guests were staring, trying to understand what was happening. Margaret Ashford had approached from the head table, her expression confused and slightly annoyed at the disruption to her perfectly orchestrated event. "General Knox, is everything all right? We don't want to keep you from the other guests." The general turned to her with polite but unmistakable authority. "Mrs. Ashford, I was just informing Sergeant Romano here about a military decoration she's receiving. The Silver Star for extraordinary heroism in combat." Margaret's expression shifted through several emotions: confusion, surprise, and something that might have been embarrassment. Her gaze moved from the general to me, taking in my tears and the obvious significance of the moment. I didn't realize Natalie had served in the military. Staff Sergeant Romano served multiple combat tours as a medic, General Knox said, his tone neutral but pointed. "She saved lives under conditions most people can't imagine. The Army is proud to recognize her service." Derek had joined us now, having left the head table when he noticed the commotion. His face was a mixture of confusion and growing realization as he looked between the general, me, and our mother-in-law-to-be. "Natalie?" Derek's voice was uncertain. "What's happened?" "Your sister," General Knox said, turning to address Derek directly, "is a war hero. She's being awarded one of our nation's highest decorations for valor in combat." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Derek stared at me as if seeing me for the first time, his expression cycling through shock, confusion, and what looked like the beginning of understanding. Behind him, Victoria had appeared, along with several other family members drawn by the unusual scene. "I don't understand," Derek said quietly. "Natalie, you never told me about any of this." The pain in his voice cut through my emotional haze. Here was my little brother, the person I'd raised and protected and sacrificed for, learning about the most significant achievement of my life from a stranger at his own wedding. "You never asked," I said simply. The truth of that statement settled over us like a heavy blanket. In all our conversations about my time overseas, Derek had asked about the weather, the food, whether I was staying safe. He'd never asked about my job, my responsibilities, what I actually did during those long deployments. It had been easier for both of us to treat my military service like an extended work assignment, rather than acknowledge the reality of combat medicine. General Knox seemed to sense the family dynamic playing out in front of him. "Perhaps I should let you process this privately," he said diplomatically. "Sergeant Romano, my aide, will contact you next week with details about the ceremony. It's been an honor to finally meet you." He moved to leave, but I found my voice. "General Knox, sir, thank you for finding the paperwork, for making sure it didn't get lost forever. It means more than you know." "The thanks belong to you, Sergeant. And to Captain Martinez, who made sure your story was told." He glanced around at the assembled family members. "You should be proud, all of you." As the general walked away, the small crowd that had gathered began to disperse, guests returning to their conversations and the band resuming their music. But the bubble around our little group remained, charged with unspoken questions and revelations that couldn't be taken back. Margaret Ashford stood awkwardly beside Derek and Victoria, clearly struggling with how to process this new information about the woman she'd dismissed as unworthy of a decent table assignment. Lisa remained close by, her presence a steadying force in the midst of family drama she'd accidentally witnessed. Derek was still staring at me, his eyes red with unshed tears. "Natalie, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. I know you didn't, but why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you ever say you were doing something so important, so dangerous?" The question deserved an honest answer, even if it was uncomfortable. "Because you were building a new life, Derek. You were becoming successful, meeting Victoria, finding your place in a world that was completely different from where we came from. The last thing you needed was your sister's war stories weighing you down." Derek started, then stopped, perhaps recognizing the truth in what I'd said. Margaret cleared her throat, her discomfort obvious. "Perhaps we should return to the reception. The cake cutting is scheduled for 9 o'clock. But Derek wasn't ready to let the moment pass. "You saved people's lives, soldiers' lives. That was my job." "Your job?" Derek's voice rose slightly. "Natalie, you're getting the Silver Star. Do you know how many people received the Silver Star?" I did know, actually. Fewer than 1,000 service members had received the Silver Star since the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan began. It wasn't something given lightly or frequently, but acknowledging that felt like bragging about something that had cost so much. "The people I saved were just doing their jobs too," I said quietly. "They were somebody's brother, somebody's son. They deserved to come home." Derek's face crumpled slightly, and I realized he was finally understanding the weight of what I'd carried alone. The responsibility, the trauma, the pride mixed with grief that every combat veteran knew. This wasn't just a medal or a moment of recognition. It was acknowledgement of experiences that had changed me in ways I'd never fully explained to anyone. Victoria stepped forward, her voice gentle but clear. "Natalie, we had no idea. Derek talks about you all the time, about how you raised him, how you sacrificed for his education, but he never mentioned your military service. Because I didn't want it to define our relationship," I said. "Derek was a kid when I enlisted. I wanted him to see me as his sister, not as someone who might not come home." Lisa, who had been quietly observing the family dynamics, finally spoke. "If I may," she said carefully, "what Sergeant Romano did at Chapman is legendary in military circles. The siege made national news, but the medical team's actions were classified for operational security. Most people never heard the full story." "What full story?" Victoria asked. Lisa glanced at me, asking permission with her eye. I nodded slightly, suddenly exhausted by years of carrying these stories alone. "The field hospital at Chapman was hit by sustained rocket and mortar fire for 6 days straight," Lisa explained. "Most bases would have evacuated non-essential personnel, but they couldn't move the wounded. Natalie and her team stayed operational under constant bombardment, performing surgeries during active attacks, keeping critically injured soldiers alive until they could be evacuated." The family listened in stunned silence as Lisa continued. "She performed emergency surgery on her commanding officer while the base was under attack, then continued treating incoming casualties for another 12 hours. By herself because the other medics had been wounded or were treating patients in different parts of the hospital." Margaret Ashford had gone very pale, her earlier dismissiveness replaced by something approaching horror. "My God," she whispered. "The citation that General Knox mentioned," Lisa added, "it doesn't just say she saved lives. It says she maintained military medical operations single-handedly under extreme duress, treating patients while under direct enemy fire, and refused evacuation until every wounded soldier had been stabilized for transport." Derek was crying now, not caring who saw him. "Natalie, why didn't you ever tell me any of this?" "Because," I said, my own voice breaking slightly, "you were 19 years old and applying to graduate schools. You were worried about grade point averages and internship applications. The last thing you needed was to spend your nights worrying about your sister getting blown up in Afghanistan. But I should have known. I should have asked. You were doing exactly what I wanted you to do, building the life we'd worked so hard to make possible for you." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of several other guests, drawn by curiosity about the earlier scene with General Knox. Among them was the older gentleman I'd noticed earlier, the one with military bearing, who'd embraced the general like an old friend. "Pardon the interruption," he said with a slight southern accent, but I couldn't help overhearing. "You're the medic from Chapman?" I nodded, wondering how many people at this wedding knew about military operations that had happened 4 years ago. "Colonel James Patterson, retired," he introduced himself. "I was part of the investigation team that reviewed the siege for lessons learned. Your actions that week were included in the training manual for combat medics. Every Army medic for the last 3 years has studied what you did." The information hit me like a physical blow. My actions at Chapman weren't just recorded in military files, they were being taught to other medics, used as examples of how to function under impossible circumstances. Derek looked like he might collapse. "They teach other soldiers about my sister. They teach them about exceptional courage under fire," Colonel Patterson corrected gently. "About maintaining focus and professionalism when everything around you is chaos. About the kind of dedication to duty that saves lives." Margaret Ashford, who had been standing frozen throughout this exchange, suddenly spoke up. "I think perhaps we should move this conversation somewhere more private." The other guests, Colonel Patterson interrupted with polite firmness, "should know they're in the presence of someone who represents the very best of American military service. If I were hosting this event, Staff Sergeant Romano would be seated at the head table." The rebuke was gentle but unmistakable. Margaret's face flushed red, her social embarrassment now complete. She'd spent the evening treating a Silver Star recipient like an unwanted relative, seating her by the kitchen while celebrating far less significant achievement. Lisa cleared her throat diplomatically. "Perhaps we should let the family have some private time to process this." Colonel Patterson nodded respectfully. "Of course, Staff Sergeant, it was an honor to meet you. Thank you for your service." As the colonel walked away, we were left with the immediate family and Lisa, who seemed reluctant to abandon me in the middle of such an emotional moment. Derek reached for my hand, his fingers trembling slightly. I'm so sorry, Natalie. Not just for tonight, but for never asking, for never understanding what you'd been through. Derek, you don't need to apologize for living the life we worked to give you. But I do, he insisted. I need to apologize for letting you carry all of this alone, for being so focused on my own success that I forgot to honor yours. Victoria was crying now too, her perfectly applied makeup streaking down her cheeks. Natalie, I'm so ashamed of how we treated you tonight. The seating arrangement, the way my mother spoke to you. Victoria, this isn't your fault. It is though, Margaret said quietly, her voice barely audible above the reception noise. It absolutely is my fault. I made assumptions about you based on prejudices that have no place in how we treat people, especially family. The admission seemed to cost her considerable effort, but I could see she meant it. Margaret Ashford had built her identity around social hierarchy and proper appearances, and discovering she'd dismissed a war hero as beneath her notice had shattered something fundamental in her worldview. Miss Ashford, I said carefully, you couldn't have known about my military service. Derek and I chose to keep that part of my life private. But that's exactly the point, she replied, her composure cracking slightly. I should have gotten to know you, should have asked about your life and your experiences. Instead, I judged you based on your clothes and your address and your job at the Veterans Clinic. She paused, and I could see her connecting pieces she should have put together earlier. The Veterans Clinic, you work with former soldiers because you are one. I work there because I understand what they're going through. The transition to civilian life isn't easy for anyone, but it's especially difficult for combat veterans. They need people who've been where they've been. And you've been where they've been, Victoria said softly. You've seen combat, experienced trauma, carried burdens that most of us can't imagine. We all carry different burdens, I said diplomatically, though the truth was that very few people in this ballroom had faced the kinds of life and death decisions that defined my military service. Lisa, who had been quietly observing our family drama, finally spoke up. If you don't mind me saying, this conversation is exactly why so many veterans struggle with civilian life. We're trained to downplay our service, to minimize our experiences, so we don't make civilians uncomfortable. But that means our families and communities never really understand what we've contributed. Her words struck home in a way that surprised me. I had been minimizing my service, treating it as something to be hidden rather than honored. Not because I wasn't proud of what I'd done, but because it seemed easier than explaining experiences that were outside most people's frame of reference. Derek squeezed my hand tighter. No more minimizing, he said firmly. I want to know everything, Natalie. I want to understand what you went through, what you accomplished, what it cost you to serve. Derek, some of those stories aren't easy to hear. Then we'll hear them together, Victoria added, as a family. Because that's what you are, family. And family means knowing each other's whole story, not just the comfortable parts. Margaret nodded emphatically, tears streaming down her face now. I've made a terrible mistake tonight, Natalie. Not just with the seating arrangement, but with my entire attitude toward you. Can you forgive me? The question hung in the air, weighted with genuine remorse and the promise of changed behavior. Looking at Margaret's tear-stained face, I saw not the imperious social matriarch who'd dismissed me earlier, but a woman confronting her own prejudices and finding them wanting. There's nothing to forgive, I said, meaning it. You didn't know my story because I chose not to share it. That's on me as much as anyone. But the way I treated you, the assumptions I made, you treated me based on the information you had. I said gently. Now you have different information. What matters is what you do with it. Derek looked around at his new family, then back at me. What I want to do is start over. All of us. I want to have the wedding reception you deserved, where you're honored for who you are and what you've accomplished. Derek, the reception is fine, you don't need to change anything. Actually, Victoria said with growing determination, we absolutely do need to change something. Starting with where you're sitting. Before I could protest, Victoria was striding toward the head table, her wedding dress rustling with purpose. Derek followed her, and after a moment's hesitation, so did Margaret and I. Lisa trailed behind, looking like she'd rather be anywhere else but seemingly unwilling to abandon me in the middle of this family drama. Victoria reached the head table and began rearranging place cards with the efficiency of someone accustomed to getting things done. Move over, she told the best man. Derek's sister belongs at the family table. Victoria, you don't have to do this, I protested, embarrassed by the public display and conscious of the other guests watching our procession across the ballroom. Yes, I do, she said firmly, creating a space between Derek's seat and her own. This is where you should have been sitting all along. Derek was beaming now, his earlier tears replaced by determined joy. Come on, Nat. Let's finish this celebration properly. As I settled into my new seat at the head table, I caught sight of General Knox across the ballroom. He raised his champagne glass in a small salute, his expression approving. Around us, the other wedding guests gradually returned to their conversations, though I noticed more than a few curious glances in our direction. Ladies and gentlemen, Derek said, standing up and tapping his champagne glass for attention. I'd like to make another toast. The reception quieted, faces turning expectantly toward the head table. Earlier tonight, I thanked many people who helped make me the man I am today. But I made a terrible omission, one I need to correct. Derek's voice carried across the ballroom with new confidence. I want to thank my sister, Staff Sergeant Natalie Romano, who not only raised me after our parents died, but also served our country with extraordinary courage and distinction. The applause that followed was different from the polite clapping that had greeted his earlier speech. This was genuine, sustained, and filled with respect. Natalie is being awarded the Silver Star for her heroic actions during combat operations in Afghanistan, Derek continued. She saved lives under conditions I can't even imagine. And she did it while carrying the burden of raising a teenager back home. She is the bravest person I know, and I'm proud to call her my sister. The applause intensified, and I saw several guests rising to their feet in recognition. Among them was General Knox, whose standing ovation seemed to prompt others to follow suit. Within moments, the entire ballroom was on its feet, applauding not just Derek's words but the service they represent. Through my tears, I saw Margaret Ashford, clapping as enthusiastically as anyone, her face radiant with something that looked like pride. Victoria was crying and laughing at the same time, squeezing my hand while maintaining her own applause. But it was Derek's face that meant the most. My little brother, the boy I'd raised and protected and worried over, was looking at me with unmistakable admiration and love. For the first time in years, he wasn't seeing me as the sister who'd sacrificed for him, but as someone worthy of celebration in her own right. As the applause finally died down and conversations resumed, Derek leaned over to whisper in my ear. I'm sorry it took so long for me to see you clearly, Nat. Really see you? You see me now? I whispered back. That's what mattered. And sitting at the head table of my brother's wedding, surrounded by family who finally understood my story, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. I felt seen, honored, and valued not despite my experiences, but because of them. The real celebration was just beginning. The standing ovation had barely ended when I noticed the shift in the room's energy. What had been polite wedding chatter transformed into something more charged, more purposeful. Guests were approaching the head table with a reverence I'd never experienced in civilian life, their faces carrying expressions I recognized from military ceremonies, but had never expected to see at a family celebration. A distinguished woman in her 60s was the first to reach us, her silver hair elegantly styled and her navy dress adorned with a small lapel pin that caught the light. Sergeant Romano, she said with quiet dignity, I'm Eleanor Whitfield. My son was evacuated from Chapman during the siege. The name hit me like electricity. Corporal Michael Whitfield, 22 years old, shrapnel wounds to the chest and abdomen. I'd worked on him for 3 hours straight, fighting to stabilize him for evacuation, while mortars exploded outside our medical tent. His injuries had been so severe that I'd honestly doubted he would survive the flight to Germany. Michael, I breathed, the memory flooding back in vivid detail. How is he? Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, but her smile was radiant. He's a doctor now, actually. Pediatric surgery at Children's Hospital in Seattle. He says you're the reason he went into medicine, that watching you work under such impossible conditions inspired him to save lives the way you saved his. The revelation staggered me. I'd treated dozens of wounded soldiers during my deployments, but the chaos of combat medicine meant I rarely learned what happened to them after evacuation. Knowing that Michael had not only survived but thrived, that he'd chosen to dedicate his life to healing others, felt like receiving an unexpected gift. He wanted to be here tonight, Eleanor continued, but he's in surgery. When General Knox told us about the Silver Star ceremony, Michael insisted I attend in his place. He wanted me to thank you personally. Mrs. Whitfield, there's no need to thank me. I was just doing my job. No, she said firmly, her voice carrying the authority of a mother who'd watched her child fight for life. You were doing God's work. Michael remembers you holding his hand while you worked, telling him stories to keep him conscious. He says you sang to him during the surgery. I did remember that now, though it seemed like a detail from someone else's life. Michael had been drifting in and out of consciousness, and I'd learned that keeping wounded soldiers talking or listening helped maintain their connection to life. I'd sung old country songs my father had loved, my voice barely audible over the sound of incoming fire. He still hums those songs when he's nervous, Eleanor added with a tearful laugh. His wife thinks it's just a quirk, but I know better. Those songs are part of why he's alive today. Derek was staring at this exchange with an expression I couldn't quite read, his face cycling through emotions too complex to name. Victoria had moved closer to my other side, her hand resting protectively on my shoulder as if she could somehow shield me from the weight of these revelations. Eleanor wasn't finished. Michael asked me to give you this, she said, pulling a small box from her purse. Inside was a simple gold locket, worn but beautiful. It belonged to his grandmother, my mother. She was a nurse in World War II, served in field hospitals in France. Michael wanted you to have it, because he says you're the same kind of woman she was, someone who runs toward danger to help others. The locket felt heavy in my palm, weighted with history and meaning I wasn't sure I deserved. Mrs. Whitfield, this is too precious. I can't accept something so personal. You can and you will, she said with maternal firmness, because you gave me back my son, and there's no gift too precious for that. As Eleanor stepped back to rejoin her table, I noticed that other guests were waiting respectfully for their turn to approach. The next was Colonel Patterson, whom I'd met earlier, but now he was accompanied by two other men whose bearing immediately identified them as military. Sergeant Romano, Colonel Patterson said formally, I'd like you to meet Major William Torres and Sergeant First Class David Kim. They both served under your medical care during different deployments. Major Torres stepped forward first, a man in his early 30s, with kind eyes and a slight limp that spoke of old injuries. Sergeant Romano, you probably don't remember me, but you treated me at the field hospital in Helmand Province in IED blast, multiple fractures in my left leg. I studied his face, searching my memory for the thousands of soldiers I'd treated over multiple deployments. Slowly, the details emerged. You were the major who kept asking about your men while I was setting your leg. You wouldn't let me give you pain medication until I confirmed that everyone in your unit had been accounted for. Torres smiled, clearly pleased that I remembered. That's right. You told me that leadership meant taking care of my people, but I couldn't take care of anyone if I didn't let you take care of me first. Smart advice, I said, though I didn't remember being quite so wise in the moment. It changed my perspective on leadership. Torres continued. I've been teaching that lesson to junior officers ever since, that accepting help when you need it isn't weakness, it's responsibility. You probably saved more than my leg that day, Sergeant. You saved my career and my ability to keep serving my soldiers. Sergeant First Class Kim stepped forward next, a stocky man with graying hair and laugh lines around his eyes. Ma'am, you might not remember me either, but I was the supply sergeant who came in with that convoy attack in late 20. Concussion and shrapnel wound. The memory surfaced more easily this time. Kim had been one of a group of casualties brought in after a convoy hit an improvised explosive device. His injuries hadn't been the most severe, but he'd been exhibiting signs of traumatic brain injury that required careful monitoring. You stayed awake all night with a concussion because you were worried about inventory reports, I said, the details coming back clearly now. I had to threaten to sedate you to get you to rest. Kim laughed, a sound that drew smiles from the people around us. Yes, you told me that supply sergeants were the backbone of the army, but dead supply sergeants couldn't keep anyone supplied. Still true, I replied. Well, I took that advice to heart. I'm working as a logistics coordinator for veteran services now, making sure former soldiers get the resources they need during transition. You taught me that taking care of people was more important than taking care of paperwork. As Kim and Torres moved back to rejoin their families, I became aware that a small crowd had formed around the head table. Not just curious wedding guests, but a collection of people with military bearing, with purposeful expressions, with stories they wanted to share. Lisa leaned over to whisper in my ear. I think General Knox put out some kind of word through military networks. These people didn't just happen to be at a Napa Valley wedding. She was probably right. The odds of this many veterans being randomly invited to Derek's wedding were astronomical. Knox had somehow orchestrated this gathering, turning a social event into an impromptu recognition ceremony. The next person to approach was a woman about my age, her auburn hair streaked with premature gray and her green dress elegant, but understated. She She walked with a slight hesitancy that suggested old injuries, and her eyes held the particular depth that came from seeing too much too young. Sergeant Romano, I'm Captain Rebecca Martinez. The name stopped my heart. Martinez, as in Captain Roberto Martinez, my commanding officer at Chapman, the man who'd recommended me for the Silver Star before his death. Captain Martinez's daughter, she confirmed, reading the recognition in my face. My father wrote about you in his letters home. He said you were the best medic he'd ever worked with, that you had instincts that couldn't be taught and courage that couldn't be faked. Talking about Roberto Martinez was still difficult, even years after his death. He'd been more than a commanding officer. He'd been a mentor, a friend, and the closest thing to a father figure I'd had since my own parents died. Your father was a good man and a great officer, I managed. He taught me everything I know about combat medicine. He taught you technique, Rebecca corrected gently. But what you did at Chapman went beyond technique. Dad's letters described the siege in detail, how you kept working even when the medical tent was taking direct fire, how you performed surgeries during active bombardment, how you refused evacuation until every wounded soldier was stable. She paused, her voice becoming more emotional. He wrote that watching you work was like watching someone discover what they were born to do. He said you had a calling, not just a job. Derek had gone very quiet beside me, his attention completely focused on Rebecca's work. I could feel his growing understanding of what my military service had really meant, not just to me but to the people whose lives I'd touched. Dad's last letter mentioned the Silver Star recommendation, Rebecca continued. He was so proud of that citation, so determined to make sure your heroism was properly recognized. When he was killed 2 months later, I thought that recognition had died with him. Her voice broke slightly, but she composed herself with the discipline that clearly ran in the Martinez family. General Knox contacted me last week when the paperwork finally surfaced. He wanted the family to know that Dad's recommendation had been approved, that his final official act as an officer was being honored. The weight of that revelation settled over me like a physical force. Roberto's last official act hadn't been a routine report or administrative duty. It had been advocating for my recognition, ensuring that my service was documented and valued. I have something for you, Rebecca said, reaching into her small purse. She withdrew a folded American flag, worn but carefully preserved. This was Dad's burial flag. I know he would want you to have it. Captain Martinez, I couldn't possibly take that. It belongs with your family. You are family, she said firmly. Dad's letters made that clear. He wrote that his medical team was the family he'd chosen in service, and that you were the person he trusted most to carry on his legacy of caring for soldiers. The flag felt impossibly heavy as she pressed it into my hands, weighted with honor and sacrifice, and the trust of a man who died believing in something larger than himself. Around us, the wedding reception continued, but it felt distant and surreal compared to this moment of military tradition and remembrance. Victoria was crying openly now, her perfectly applied makeup completely destroyed by tears she didn't seem to notice or care about. Derek's face had gone pale, his expression suggesting that he was finally grasping the true scope of what I'd experienced in service. There's something else, Rebecca said, her voice dropping to a more private tone. General Knox mentioned that you work at a veterans clinic now. Dad would have loved that. He always said the hardest part of military medicine wasn't the combat. It was watching soldiers struggle with civilian healthcare systems that didn't understand their experience. It's rewarding work, I said simply, though that barely captured the complexity of helping veterans navigate civilian life after military service. I'm sure it is. I wanted you to know that I'm a social worker now, specializing in military family support. Dad's death taught me how important it is to take care of the families behind the uniform, the people who sacrifice at home while their loved ones serve overseas. The connection between Roberto's death and his daughter's career choice was both heartbreaking and inspiring. Even in loss, the Martinez family had found ways to serve others, to honor Roberto's memory through continued service. As Rebecca stepped back to rejoin the other guests, I noticed that General Knox had positioned himself near the head table, clearly orchestrating the flow of people who wanted to speak with me. His expression was watchful but approving, like a commander overseeing a successful operation. The next person to approach was unexpected, Margaret Ashford herself, but now she was accompanied by an elderly man I hadn't met. Her earlier composure had been replaced by something more vulnerable, more genuine than the social polish she'd displayed earlier in the evening. Natalie, she said quietly, I wanted you to meet my father, Richard Ashford Sr. He's the one who insisted General Knox be invited to the wedding. The elderly man stepped forward with the careful movements of someone well into his 80s, but his eyes were sharp and alert. When he extended his hand, I noticed the tattoo on his forearm, faded but unmistakable military insignia. Staff Sergeant Romano, he said in a voice still strong despite his age. It's an honor to meet you. I served in Vietnam 1st Cavalry Division. I know something about battlefield medicine, and what it costs the people who practice it. Margaret's expression was chastened as she watched her father greet me with obvious respect and recognition. Dad has been telling me stories about his own service, since General Knox announced your Silver Star. I'm ashamed to admit I never really listened before tonight. Vietnam was a different war, I said carefully, not wanting to diminish his service while acknowledging the obvious generational differences in our experiences. War is war, Richard Sr. replied firmly. The weapons change, the politics change, but what it takes to run toward danger instead of away from it, that never changes. What you did at Chapman would have been heroic in any war, in any. Margaret looked increasingly uncomfortable, clearly recognizing how badly she'd misjudged, not just me but the entire concept of service and sacrifice. Dad, maybe you could tell Natalie about the Memorial Foundation. Richard Sr.'s face lit up slightly. Ah yes, the foundation. Margaret, despite her many talents, has never fully appreciated the military connection in our family history, but we've been supporting veteran services for decades. Medical care, transition assistance, family support program. The information reframed everything I'd thought I understood about the Ashford family. They weren't just wine country elite collecting tax deductions through charitable giving. They had genuine connections to military service, personal understanding of what veterans need. The foundation has been looking for someone with real field experience to help guide our medical programs, Richard Sr. continued. Someone who understands both military medicine and veteran transition challenges. After tonight, after learning about your service and your current work, I wonder if you might be interested in consulting with us. The offer was unexpected and intriguing. Working with an established foundation could amplify the impact of the veteran services I was already providing, reach soldiers I couldn't help through the small clinic where I currently worked. I'd be very interested in learning more about that, I said honestly.
Margaret stepped forward, her voice tentative but sincere. Natalie, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you my gratitude and my respect. What you've done, what you've sacrificed, it's exactly the kind of service our foundation was created to honor. Mrs. Ashford, you don't owe me anything. You're opening your family to Derek, and that's more than enough. It's not enough, she insisted. Not nearly enough. And please, call me Margaret. We're family now, and family doesn't seat each other by the kitchen. The reference to the evening's seating debacle might have been awkward, but Margaret's self-deprecating tone made it feel more like acknowledging a shared mistake than reopening old wounds. Richard Sr. clapped his hands together with obvious satisfaction. Excellent. Then it's settled. Margaret will set up a proper meeting next week to discuss the foundation work, and tonight we celebrate both the wedding and the recognition of a genuine American hero. As the Ashfords moved back toward their table, Lisa appeared at my elbow with 2 fresh glasses of champagne. How are you holding up? She asked quietly. This has been quite an evening for you. I feel like I'm living in someone else's life, I admitted. 3 hours ago I was the embarrassing relative hidden in the corner. Now I'm apparently the guest of honor at an impromptu military recognition ceremony. Sometimes life changes that fast, Lisa said philosophically. The trick is figuring out how to handle the new reality. Derek leaned over to join our conversation, his face still showing the emotional impact of the evening's revelations. Natalie, I keep thinking about all the conversations we've had over the years, all the times you deflected questions about your deployment. I thought you were just being modest about a boring desk job. It wasn't boring, I said with a slight smile, but it also wasn't the kind of thing you discuss over Sunday dinner. But maybe it should have been, Derek replied seriously. Maybe I should have been mature enough to hear about your real experiences, instead of letting you protect me from uncomfortable truths. Victoria nodded emphatically. Derek's right. We've all been letting you carry these experiences alone, and that's not military families are supposed to support each other through deployment and reintegration, but somehow we missed that you needed support too. I chose not to ask for support, I pointed out. That's different from not receiving it. Is it? Lisa interjected. Because from what I've observed tonight, Your family genuinely didn't know how to support something they didn't understand. That's pretty common with veterans who compartmentalize their service to protect their loved ones. Her words hit closer to home than I was comfortable admitting. I had compartmentalized my military service, created artificial separation between Sergeant Romano, the combat medic, and Natalie Romano, the big sister. The problem was that those weren't really two different people, they were aspects of the same person trying to navigate two very different worlds. So what happens now? Derek asked. How do we move forward with this new understanding? Before I could answer, the band struck up a slower song and couples began moving toward the dance floor. General Knox appeared beside our table as if summoned by the music. His formal bearing slightly relaxed but still unmistakably military. Sergeant Romano, he said with a slight smile, would you honor me with a dance? The request was formal, old-fashioned and completely unexpected. Around us, conversations quieted as people noticed the four-star general extending a personal invitation to someone they were still trying to understand. General Knox, I'm honored, but I should mention that I'm not much of a dancer. Neither am I, he admitted, with a chuckle. But some traditions are worth preserving, even imperfectly. Besides, I have something I'd like to discuss with you privately. I accepted his offered arm and allowed him to escort me to the dance floor, conscious that we were drawing attention from every corner of the ballroom. The general's dancing was indeed modest, but his bearing transformed even simple steps into something dignified and purposeful. Sergeant Romano, he said quietly as we moved through a basic waltz, tonight has been an unusual evening for everyone involved. Yes, sir, it has. I want you to know that what happened here wasn't entirely spontaneous. When I learned you would be attending this wedding, I made some discreet inquiries through military network. Several of the people who spoke with you tonight requested permission to attend specifically to thank you personally. You orchestrated this, I facilitated it, he corrected. The gratitude, the respect, the recognition, that all belongs to you. I simply created an opportunity for it to be expressed. We danced in silence for a moment while I processed this information. General Knox had essentially turned Derek's wedding reception into a military appreciation event, using his influence to gather people whose lives I'd touched during my service. Why? I asked finally, why was this important to you? General Knox's expression grew more serious. Because, Sergeant Romano, too many veterans transition to civilian life without ever understanding the impact of their service. You've spent the last 3 years working with veterans who struggle with that same lack of recognition, that same sense that their sacrifice went unnoticed. He guided me through a turn, his movements precise despite his earlier disclaimer about dancing ability. Tonight you got to see what I see when I review your service record, not just a list of duties performed, but lives changed, careers inspired, futures made possible because of your skill and courage. Sir, I appreciate what you've done tonight, but I don't need recognition to know my service was worthwhile. No, you don't, he agreed. But your family needed to understand what you sacrificed for them and for your country, and frankly so did you. The song was ending, but General Knox's words stayed with me as he escorted me back to the head table. Around us, the wedding reception continued with renewed energy, but something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer the forgotten sister seated by the kitchen. I was Staff Sergeant Natalie Romano, Silver Star recipient, respected by peers and honored by leadership. Derek stood as I returned to my seat, his face transformed by understanding and pride. Natalie, he said loud enough for nearby guests to hear, would you save a dance for your little brother? I think we have some catching up to do. I'd be honored, I replied, meaning it completely. As Derek led me back to the dance floor, I caught sight of Margaret Ashford at her table, deep in conversation with several other guests. Her earlier dismissiveness had been replaced by animated discussion, her gestures indicating she was sharing stories about military service and sacrifice. The transformation was remarkable, but it also felt earned. Margaret hadn't just learned new information about me, she'd been challenged to reconsider her entire framework for understanding value and worth. Tonight had forced her to confront the limitations of judging people by superficial markers instead of looking deeper into their character and contributions. Dancing with Derek felt like coming full circle, like reclaiming a relationship that had been complicated by secrets and assumptions. My little brother, the boy I'd raised and protected, was finally seeing me as someone worthy of protection and pride in return. Thank you, he whispered as we moved through the steps. For what? For everything. For raising me, for serving our country, for being the kind of person who saves lives even when no one's watching, for being my sister. Around us, The ballroom was filled with music and laughter and celebration, but at its center was something deeper: recognition, understanding, and the rebuilding of relationships on foundations of truth rather than convenience. The real party was just getting started. The dance with Derek ended as the band transitioned to a more upbeat song, but neither of us seemed ready to break the emotional connection we'd just rebuilt. We stood on the dance floor for a moment, surrounded by other couples but focused entirely on each other, both of us wiping away tears that had nothing to do with sadness. "You know what I keep thinking about," Derek said as we finally made our way back toward the head table. "All those nights when I was in college, stressed about exams or internship applications, calling you at all hours because I was worried about my future. And the whole time, you were dealing with actual life and death situations, saving people's lives, and you never once made me feel like my problems weren't important." "Your problems were important," I said firmly. "They were important because you were important to me. That's what family does. We protect each other's dreams, even when the scale seems different." Victoria intercepted us before we reached the table, her face glowing with an emotion I couldn't quite identify. "Natalie, there's someone else who wants to meet you, someone She gestured toward a corner of the ballroom where I noticed a small commotion. A woman in a wheelchair was being helped closer to our area by what appeared to be family members, her movement careful but determined. She looked to be in her 40s, with graying brown hair and intelligent eyes that seemed vaguely familiar. "That's Dr. Sarah Chen," Victoria explained, and my heart stopped. "Lisa's older sister. She insisted on coming tonight when she heard about the Silver Star announcement." Dr. Sarah Chen. The name connected immediately to memories I'd tried for years to suppress. Forward Operating Base Chapman, October 2019, the second day of the siege. Dr. Chen had been the senior trauma surgeon, the person who'd worked alongside me during the worst of the casualties. She'd been injured in the rocket attack that wounded Captain Martinez, caught in the blast while helping to evacuate patients. I watched her approach, noting the wheelchair and the careful way her family moved around her, protective but respectful of her independence. The last time I'd seen Sarah Chen, she'd been unconscious on a stretcher, her surgical scrubs blood-soaked and torn, being evacuated on the same helicopter that carried Captain Martinez to Germany. "Sergeant Romano," she said as her wheelchair came to a stop in front of me, her voice warm but carrying undertones of shared trauma that only combat veterans would recognize. "I've been hoping to see you again, though I never imagined it would be at a wedding in Napa Valley." "Dr. Chen," I managed, my voice catching slightly. "I wondered what happened to you after the evacuation. I tried to follow up through medical channels, but the information was classified." "Sarah," she corrected with a slight smile. "We've shared foxholes, so I think we can use first name. And yes, the medical records were sealed for operational security. But I'm here now, and I have some things to tell you." Lisa had appeared beside her sister, her expression suggesting she'd orchestrated this reunion. Sarah wanted to fly out from Boston specifically for tonight. When General Knox mentioned the Silver Star ceremony, she insisted on being here. Sarah reached out to take my hand, her grip still strong despite whatever injuries had left her wheelchair-bound. "Natalie, I need you to understand something about what happened during the siege. The official reports credited me with maintaining surgical operations under fire, but that's not the complete truth." My stomach clenched. I'd always wondered about the details of that final day, the rocket attack that had changed everything. My memories of the immediate aftermath were fragmented, clouded by adrenaline and the chaos of mass casualties. "What do you mean?" "I mean that when the rockets hit the surgical tent, I was knocked unconscious immediately. Concussion, spinal injuries, internal bleeding. I was down for the count, and we had 6 critical patients who needed immediate surgery to survive." Sarah's voice grew stronger as she continued. "You performed those surgeries, Natalie, all 6 of them." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. I remembered treating wounded soldiers after the attack, but in my memory I'd been assisting Dr. Chen, following her instructions even as she dealt with her own injuries. "That's not possible," I said weakly. "I'm not a surgeon. I don't have the training or the certification to perform major operations." "You had something better," Sarah replied firmly. "You had 3 years of combat medicine experience, natural surgical instincts, and the courage to do what needed to be done when there was no one else to do it." Derek had moved closer, his face pale as he tried to process what he was hearing. Victoria stood beside him, her hand gripping his arm for support. Around us, other guests had begun to gather, drawn by the intensity of our conversation. Sarah continued, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being believed in medical matters. I regained consciousness 6 hours after the attack, in the evacuation helicopter. My first question was about the patients we'd been treating. The medic told me all 6 had been successfully stabilized, and were expected to survive. She paused, her eyes never leaving mine. When I asked who had performed the surgeries, he said Staff Sergeant Romano had taken over operations after Dr. Chen was injured. He said you'd worked for 6 straight hours, performing procedures that would challenge experienced trauma surgeons in fully equipped hospitals. I remember working on wounded soldiers, I said carefully, but I was following protocols, using training. I wasn't improvising surgery. Natalie, Sarah said gently but firmly, you performed a thoracic surgery on a patient with penetrating chest wounds. You did a laparotomy on a soldier with abdominal injuries. You conducted emergency neurosurgery on a patient with skull fracture. These weren't field dressing applications. These were complex surgical procedures that saved lives. The memories came flooding back then, vivid and terrible and overwhelming. The smell of blood and antiseptic. The sound of monitoring equipment competing with distant explosions. The weight of responsibility as I worked on patients whose injuries exceeded anything in my training manual. I remembered the chest surgery now, working by feel and instinct, to repair damage to a soldier's lung. The abdominal surgery, fighting to control bleeding from organs I'd only studied in textbooks. The neurosurgery, the most terrifying procedure of my career, removing bone fragments from around a brainstem, while praying I wouldn't cause more damage. I was terrified, I whispered, the admission escaping before I could stop it. Every procedure, every decision, I kept thinking I was going to kill someone. But you didn't, Sarah said with quiet intensity. You saved them all. 6 soldiers went home to their families, because you had the skill and courage to attempt procedures that most medics would never consider. Derek was staring at me with an expression of complete bewilderment. Natalie, you performed brain surgery on a battlefield. Emergency neurosurgery, Sarah corrected. Under combat conditions, with basic equipment, while the base was under active attack. It was the kind of procedure that surgeons in major hospitals approach with teams of specialists and hours of preparation. How is that even possible? Victoria asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah smiled, the expression transforming her face and making her look years younger. Because your sister-in-law is what we call a natural. Some people have instincts for music or mathematics. Natalie has instincts for trauma medicine. She can see injuries and immediately understand what needs to be done to fix them. Lisa nodded emphatically. It's incredibly rare. Most combat medics are excellent at field treatment and stabilization, but very few have the intuitive understanding of anatomy and physiology that allows for complex surgical intervention. The Army recognized this after Chapman, Sarah continued. Your actions during the siege were studied at medical schools, used as case studies in trauma surgery programs. The procedures you performed have been incorporated into advanced combat medicine training. The information was overwhelming, adding layers of significance to experiences I'd tried to compartmentalize and move beyond. It was difficult enough processing the Silver Star recognition, but learning that my improvised surgical work was being taught to other medics felt surreal. There's something else, Sarah said, reaching into a bag attached to her wheelchair. Something I've been carrying for 3 years, waiting for the chance to give it to you. She withdrew a thick folder, its contents obviously well organized and carefully maintained. These are follow-up reports on the 6 patients you treated during the siege. Medical records, recovery timelines, current status reports. I've been tracking their progress through Military Medical Network. My hands trembled as I accepted the folder, unsure whether I wanted to know what had happened to those soldiers. Combat medicine often meant working frantically to save lives without ever learning whether your efforts had been successful in the long term. Open it, Sarah encouraged gently. You deserve to know the impact of what you did. The first page contained a photograph of a young soldier in dress uniform, smiling broadly at what appeared to be a graduation ceremony. The accompanying report indicated that specialist James Morrison, the patient I'd performed chest surgery on, had made a complete recovery and was now training to become a military paramedic himself. The second file showed Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, the abdominal surgery patient, at her wedding 6 months after returning from deployment. The medical notes indicated full recovery with no lasting complications from her injury. Page by page, the folder revealed the lives that had continued because of those terrifying hours at Chapman. Soldiers who'd returned to their families, completed their educations, started careers, gotten married, had children, 6 people whose futures had hung in the balance during the darkest moment of my military service. The neurosurgery patient, Corporal Anthony Park, had not only survived, but had completed law school, and was now working as a veterans advocate, specializing in helping former soldiers navigate disability benefits and medical care systems. "This is impossible," I said, my voice breaking as I flipped through the files. I was making it up as I went along. I was terrified I was going to make everything worse. "That's what made you extraordinary," Sarah replied. "You were scared, but you did it anyway. You took responsibility for lives when you weren't sure you could save them, and you found ways to succeed despite your fear." Derek had moved to read over my shoulder, his face cycling through amazement, pride, and something that looked like grief. "Natalie, why didn't you ever tell me about this? Why didn't you tell me you'd saved 6 people's lives in a single day?" "Because," I said, quietly, "I never thought about it that way. I thought about how scared I was, how unprepared I felt, how many things could have gone wrong. I thought about Captain Martinez being wounded, about Dr. Chen being evacuated, about being left alone with responsibilities I wasn't sure I could handle." "But you did handle them," Victoria said firmly. "You saved 6 lives using skills you didn't even know you had." Sarah leaned forward in her wheelchair, her expression intense. "Natalie, there's one more thing you need to understand. The medical procedures you performed at Chapman weren't just successful, they were innovative. Some of your improvisations are now part of standard trauma surgery protocol." The revelation staggered me. "What do you mean, innovative?" "The technique you used for the chest surgery, the way you managed to repair lung damage with limited equipment, that approach is now taught in combat medicine course. The abdominal procedure you performed has been refined and incorporated into field surgery manuals." Sarah's voice carried professional admiration that felt overwhelming. "You didn't just save lives, Natalie. You advanced the field of combat medicine." Lisa nodded enthusiastically. "Sarah's been presenting papers about the Chapman siege at medical conferences for the past 2 years. The surgical innovations that came out of that day have influenced trauma medicine around the world." I stared at the folder in my hands, trying to reconcile the person they were describing with my own memories of being terrified and improvising frantically to keep people alive. The disconnect between my internal experience and the external recognition felt almost unbearable. "I need some air," I said suddenly, the weight of revelations and recognition becoming too much to process. "I need a moment." Derek immediately moved to follow me, but I held up a hand. "Just a few minutes alone, okay? I promise I'm not leaving." Victoria nodded understandingly. "The garden doors are just past the bar. Take all the time you need." I made my way through the reception crowd, clutching the folder of patient files and feeling disconnected from the celebration around me. The terrace doors opened onto a beautifully landscaped garden, lit by soft outdoor lighting and offering a peaceful contrast to the ballroom's energy. The cool evening air felt like a blessing against my flushed skin. I found a bench beside a fountain and sat down, finally allowing myself to process everything I'd learned in the past few hours. The Silver Star recognition, the stories from soldiers whose lives I'd touched, the revelation about my improvised surgeries being incorporated into military training. "Mind if I join you?" I looked up to find General Knox approaching, his formal military bearing slightly relaxed in the garden setting. "Of course, sir." He settled onto the bench beside me, both of us facing the fountain and the lights of the vineyard beyond. For a moment we sat in comfortable silence, 2 military professionals processing the weight of the evening's revelations. "Overwhelming night," he said finally. "Yes, sir, it has been. Dr. Chen asked me to find you. She was worried that her information might have been too much to process all at once." I considered his words carefully. "It's not that it was too much, exactly. It's that it changes how I understand my own experiences. For 3 years I've been carrying memories of being scared and unprepared. Tonight I'm learning that what I remember as improvisation and panic, other people see as innovation and heroism." General Knox nodded thoughtfully. "That's a common experience for combat veterans, especially those who performed exceptionally under pressure. We tend to focus on our internal experience of fear and uncertainty rather than the external results of our actions. How do you reconcile those 2 perspectives?" "By accepting that both can be true simultaneously," he replied. "You were scared and unprepared, and you also saved 6 lives through surgical procedures that advance the field of combat medicine. Fear doesn't negate heroism, Sergeant. Sometimes it enhances it." We sat quietly for another moment before he continued. "There's something else I wanted to discuss with you, something that might help put tonight's revelations into perspective. Sir, the Army has been following your civilian work at the Veterans Clinic. Your success rate with helping former soldiers transition to civilian life is remarkable, significantly higher than national averages. I wasn't sure where he was going with this information. I enjoy the work, and I understand what they're going through. It's more than that, General Knox said firmly. Your approach to veteran services has been studied by the Department of Veterans Affairs. Some of your counseling techniques and support programs are being piloted at other facilities. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Whether in combat medicine or veteran services, my work was apparently having impacts beyond what I'd realized or intended. Sir, with respect, I'm just doing my job. I'm not trying to revolutionize anything. That's exactly what makes you exceptional, he replied. You focus on solving problems and helping people, without worrying about recognition or credit. The innovations happen naturally because you're willing to try whatever works, regardless of whether it's conventional. General Knox stood up, straightening his jacket in preparation to return to the reception. Sergeant Romano, tonight wasn't just about recognizing your past service. It was about helping you understand the continuing impact of your work and the importance of accepting the recognition you've earned. I'm not sure I know how to do that, sir. Start by going back inside and finishing the celebration with your family. They're proud of you and they have good reason to be. He paused at the garden door. And Sergeant, tomorrow, start thinking about how you want to use this recognition to expand your impact. The Army, the VA, and organizations like the Ashford Foundation are all interested in working with you to help more veterans. As General Knox disappeared back into the reception, I remained on the bench for a few more minutes, processing his words and the implications of the evening's revelations. The folder of patient files sat beside me, tangible proof that my actions had consequences beyond what I'd understood. When I finally returned to the ballroom, I found my family and friends waiting with expressions of concern and support. Derek immediately approached, his face showing the emotional impact of everything he'd learned about my military service. Are you okay? He asked simply. I'm getting there, I replied honestly. It's a lot to process. We don't have to talk about any of it tonight, Victoria offered. We can just focus on celebrating the wedding. No, I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. I think I've spent enough time not talking about important things. If you want to know about my service, about what I did overseas, I'm ready to share those stories. Derek's face lit up with relief and anticipation. Really? You'd be willing to tell us about your experience? The real experiences, I confirmed. Not the sanitized versions I've been giving you for the past 3 years. The scary parts, the meaningful parts, the parts that changed me and the parts that I'm proud of. Sarah Chen had wheeled her chair closer during my absence, and now she smiled with obvious approval. That's wonderful, Natalie. Your experiences deserve to be shared and honored, not hidden away. Lisa raised her champagne glass in a small toast. To new understandings and honest conversation. As we clinked glasses, I felt something shifting inside me, a willingness to integrate the different parts of my identity instead of keeping them separate. Sergeant Romano, the combat medic, and Natalie Romano, the big sister, weren't different people. They were aspects of the same person who'd learned to save lives in different ways. The band struck up another slow song, and couples began moving toward the dance floor again. Derek offered me his arm with a slight bow. One more dance? He asked. This time as brother and sister who really know each other. I'd like that, I said, meaning it complete. As we moved onto the dance floor, I caught sight of Margaret Ashford at her table, deep in animated conversation with Dr. Chen about veteran medical services and foundation funding opportunity. The transformation in Margaret's understanding had been as dramatic as my own family's recognition of my service. Dancing with Derek again, I felt the final pieces of the evening's emotional puzzle clicking into place. This wasn't just about receiving overdue recognition for my military service. It was about accepting all aspects of my identity and allowing the people I loved to know and celebrate the complete person I'd become. The wedding reception continued around us, but at its heart was something deeper than celebration. It was reconciliation, understanding, and the rebuilding of relationships on foundations of truth and mutual respect. For the first time in years, I felt completely present in my own life, fully integrated and genuinely proud of the person I'd become through service, sacrifice, and the decision to keep helping others however I could. The real celebration was just beginning, and I was finally ready to be part of it. 6 months later, I stood in the Pentagon's Hall of Heroes, wearing my dress blue uniform for the first time in 3 years. The Silver Star ceremony was everything General Knox had promised it would be: formal, dignified, and overwhelming in its recognition of service that had taken place half a world away in what felt like another lifetime. Derek sat in the front row of distinguished guests, his face glowing with pride as he watched his sister receive one of the nation's highest military honors. Beside him, Victoria dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, no longer the sheltered socialite who'd married into our working-class family but someone who understood the weight of sacrifice and service. Margaret Ashford occupied the seat next to Victoria, her transformation from dismissive mother-in-law to supportive family member complete in ways I never could have imagined that night at the wedding. She'd thrown herself into learning about military service and veteran affairs with the same intensity she'd once devoted to wine country social hierarchies. The Ashford Foundation had hired me as Director of Veteran Medical Services 3 months after the wedding, a position that allowed me to expand my work from a single clinic to a network of facilities across Northern California. Margaret had been my strongest advocate within the foundation, using her social connections to raise funding and awareness for veteran transition programs. The Silver Star is awarded for gallantry in action against an enemy of the United States, the Secretary of the Army announced to the assembled crowd. Staff Sergeant Natalie Romano distinguished herself through extraordinary heroism during combat operations in Afghanistan, performing life-saving medical procedures under direct enemy fire and maintaining critical care capabilities that preserved the lives of 6 seriously wounded soldiers. The words echoed through the ceremonial hall, giving formal recognition to actions that had haunted and defined me for years. As the secretary pinned the medal to my uniform, I thought about Captain Martinez, whose recommendation had finally found its way through the military bureaucracy to this moment of acknowledgement. The reception following the ceremony was smaller than the wedding, but no less meaningful. Military colleagues, family members and veterans whose lives had intersected with mine gathered to celebrate not just the medal but the recognition of service that extended far beyond a single day of combat. Sarah Chen approached me near the refreshment table, her wheelchair navigating easily through the crowd of uniformed personnel and civilian guests. "How does it feel?" she asked with a knowing smile. "Surreal," I admit. 3 years ago, I thought those memories from Chapman were something I needed to move past. Now they're being celebrated as the defining moment of my military career. "Both can be true," Sarah replied, echoing General Knox's words from that night in the vineyard garden. "Trauma and triumph often exist in the same experiences. The key is learning to honor both aspects." She was right, of course. The therapy sessions I'd started after the wedding had helped me understand that my reluctance to discuss my military service hadn't been modesty or humility. It had been a form of survivor's guilt mixed with imposter syndrome. I'd focused so intensely on my internal experience of fear and uncertainty that I'd minimized the external reality of lives saved and medical innovations achieved. Lisa Chen joined our conversation, resplendent in her own dress uniform as one of the ceremony's honored guests. "Natalie, there's someone I'd like you to meet," she said, gesturing toward a young woman in army fatigues who'd been watching our conversation from across the room. The woman approached with the precise bearing of active-duty military, her insignia identifying her as a staff sergeant in the medical corps. "Ma'am," she said formally, "Staff Sergeant Jennifer Walsh. I'm currently serving as a combat medic with the 80th." "Staff Sergeant Walsh," I replied, automatically falling into the familiar rhythms of military protocol. "How can I help you?" "Ma'am, I wanted to thank you personally. The surgical techniques you developed at Chapman are part of our advanced training now. Last month, I used your abdominal trauma procedure to save a soldier's life during a convoy attack in Syria." The impact of her words hit me with unexpected force. My improvised surgical work wasn't just being taught in medical schools, it was being actively used by current medics to save lives in ongoing conflicts. "You saved someone using techniques I developed?" I asked, still struggling to fully accept the reach of my military contributions. "Yes, ma'am. Private First Class Marcus Johnson, age 19, multiple shrapnel wounds to the abdomen. I followed the protocols you established, and he's expected to make a full recovery." Staff Sergeant Walsh's voice carried the professional satisfaction of a job well done. "His family will get to see him come home, because you figured out how to perform complex surgery with basic field equipment." Derek had approached during this exchange, his face showing the same mixture of pride and amazement that had characterized his expression since learning the truth about my military service. "Natalie," he said quietly, "do you realize what this means? Your work is still saving lives, even though you've been out of the Army for 3 years." "It's more than that," Sarah interjected. "The innovations that came out of Chapman have influenced trauma medicine in civilian hospitals too. Emergency rooms across the country are using modified versions of Natalie's techniques to treat car accident victims, industrial injuries, and other trauma cases. The scope of impact was difficult to process. My terrified improvisation during 6 hours of combat had somehow rippled outward to influence medical care for both military and civilian patients across multiple continents and years of ongoing treatment. General Knox materialized beside our group with the quiet authority that seemed to follow him everywhere. "Sergeant Romano," he said formally, then smiled. "Or should I say Director Romano, given your new position with the Ashford Foundation. Either works, though I have to admit, the transition from combat medic to foundation executive has been interesting. I imagine it has, but from what I hear, you're applying the same innovative approach to veteran services that you brought to combat medicine. The VA is already requesting consultations on your transition programs." Margaret Ashford had joined our circle, her presence no longer awkward but genuinely welcomed. "General Knox, I wanted to thank you again for everything you did to make sure Natalie's service received proper recognition. The Foundation's work has been transformed by her leadership." "The recognition was long overdue," General Knox replied diplomatically, "but I'm more interested in what comes next. Sergeant Romano has demonstrated a remarkable ability to solve problems that others accept as unsolvable." He turned to address me directly. "There's been discussion at senior levels about creating a new position within the Department of Veterans Affairs, Director of Innovation for Veteran Medical Service. The job would involve exactly what you're doing now, but with national scope and federal resources." The offer was unexpected and intriguing, but also overwhelming. "Sir, I appreciate the consideration, but I'm not sure I'm ready for that level of responsibility." "With respect, Sergeant, you weren't ready to perform neurosurgery under fire either, but you did it anyway when it was needed." His expression was serious but encouraging. Sometimes the best candidates for difficult positions are the ones who understand the weight of the responsibility. Derek stepped closer, his voice carrying newfound confidence in offering opinions about my career decisions. "Natalie, what do you think? Would it be an opportunity to help even more veterans?" I looked around at the people who'd become my support system over the past 6 months. Derek and Victoria, who'd learned to see me as a complete person, rather than just their protective relative. Margaret, who'd transformed from dismissive mother-in-law to genuine advocate. Sarah and Lisa, who understood both the trauma and triumph of military service. General Knox, who'd orchestrated my recognition and continued to champion my work. "I think," I said slowly, "I'd like to learn more about the position. If there's an opportunity to help veterans on a national scale using lessons learned from both combat medicine and civilian transition work, that seems worth exploring." General Knox's smile suggested this was the response he'd hoped for. "Excellent. We'll arrange briefings and interviews over the next month. The position won't be available immediately. There are congressional approvals and bureaucratic processes to navigate, but I'm confident you're the right person for the role." As our conversation continued, I became aware of other discussions happening around the reception. Veterans sharing stories of their own transitions to civilian life, military families talking about deployment challenges, medical personnel comparing experiences from different combat zones. This was more than a ceremony celebrating past service. It was a gathering of people committed to ongoing service in different forms. The formal portion of the reception concluded with remarks from senior military leadership about the importance of recognizing exceptional service and the continuing obligation to support veterans in their civilian transition. As guests began to disperse, Derek and Victoria approached for what had become our traditional end-of-event conversation. "So," Derek said with a grin that reminded me of his teenage years, "how does it feel to be a decorated war hero and foundation director who's being recruited for federal service?" "Overwhelming," I admit. A year ago, I was working at a single veterans clinic and keeping my military service as private as possible. Now I'm wearing a silver star and considering a position that would put me in charge of veteran medical services for the entire country. "You've earned every bit of it," Victoria said firmly. "The wedding taught us that you've been hiding your accomplishments, not because they weren't significant, but because you were protecting everyone else from having to deal with uncomfortable truths about war and sacrifice." The past 6 months had been a process of learning to integrate different aspects of my identity rather than compartmentalizing them. Sergeant Romano, the combat medic, and Natalie Romano, the big sister, weren't separate people. They were different expressions of the same core commitment to protecting and healing others. "There's something else," Derek said, his tone becoming more serious. "Victoria and I have been talking, and we want you to know that we understand now what you sacrificed for my education
and career. Not just the money and time, but the emotional energy of carrying military trauma alone while taking care of a teenager. Derek, you don't need to. Yes, I do, he interrupted gently. I need to acknowledge that my success was built on your sacrifices, and I need to make sure you know how grateful I am. Not just for the practical support, but for the example you set about service, and putting others' needs ahead of your own. Victoria nodded emphatically. We also want you to know that any decisions you make about your career have our complete support. If you take the federal position, if you stay with the foundation, if you decide to do something completely different, we trust your judgment and will support whatever choice you make. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Staff Sergeant Walsh, who'd been waiting respectfully for a chance to speak with me privately. Ma'am, I don't want to intrude, but I wanted to give you something before I return to my unit. She handed me a small wooden box, carefully crafted and obviously handmade. This is from Private Johnson's family, she explained. His father made it in his woodworking shop, after PFC Johnson told them about the medic whose technique saved his life. Inside the box was a simple brass plaque engraved with words that took my breath away. To Staff Sergeant Romano, whose innovation under fire gave our son a future. With eternal gratitude, the Johnson family. They wanted you to know, Walsh continued, that Marcus is planning to study medicine when he completes his military service. He says he wants to become the kind of doctor who can help other people the way you helped him. The gift was overwhelming in its simplicity and meaning. Here was tangible proof that my actions during the darkest moments of my military service were continuing to ripple outward, inspiring others to choose careers in healing and service. Derek was staring at the plaque with tears in his eyes. Natalie, do you see what this means? You didn't just save that soldier's life. You probably influenced him to save other lives throughout his career. Your impact keeps multiplying. As Staff Sergeant Walsh returned to her unit and the reception wound down, I found myself standing in the Pentagon's Hall of Heroes with my family, surrounded by the portraits and citations of service members who'd received the nation's highest military honor. For the first time, I felt like I belonged in their company, not because my actions were necessarily more heroic than other veterans, but because I'd finally learned to accept recognition for service that extended beyond my own comfort zone. Margaret approached for what had become our routine end-of-event consultation about Foundation business. Natalie, before we leave, I wanted to update you on the latest funding development. The board approved expanding our veteran medical services to include 3 new facilities, and we've received inquiries from foundations in other states about replicating our program. That's wonderful news, I replied, though part of my attention was already shifting toward the federal opportunity General Knox had mentioned. There's something else, Margaret continued. I've been thinking about succession planning for your position at the Foundation, in case you decide to pursue the federal appointment. We want to make sure the transition maintains continuity for the veterans who depend on our services. Her thoughtfulness about program continuity was typical of the thorough approach Margaret had brought to veteran affairs once she understood their importance. The society matriarch who'd once seated me by the kitchen had become one of my strongest professional allies and advocates. As we prepared to leave the Pentagon, I took one final look around the Hall of Heroes, trying to memorize the moment and the feelings associated with finally receiving recognition for service I'd carried alone for years. The silver star on my uniform felt both weighty and weightless, significant in its acknowledgement of past actions, but also liberating in its promise that those experiences could be honored rather than hidden. Walking out of the Pentagon with my family, I felt a sense of completion that had been missing since my return from deployment. Not the completion of ending something, but the completion of integrating different aspects of my life into a coherent whole. Derek drove us back to the hotel, the conversation flowing easily between family updates, Foundation business, and speculation about federal opportunities. For the first time in years, there were no secrets between us, no compartmentalized experiences that couldn't be shared or discussed. So what's next? Victoria asked as we pulled into the hotel parking garage. Next, I said with growing confidence, I think I'm ready to find out how much impact one person can have when they stop hiding their capabilities and start using them intentionally. Derek grinned in the rearview mirror. The federal government has no idea what they're getting into. He was probably right. But after years of compartmentalizing my experiences and minimizing my contributions, I was finally ready to embrace the full scope of what I could accomplish when I stopped protecting others from the reality of my capability. The wedding reception that had started as a humiliation had become the catalyst for recognizing not just my past service, but my potential for future impact. Sometimes the people who try to diminish you end up highlighting exactly why you deserve recognition and respect. And sometimes the table by the kitchen turns out to be the best seat in the house, because it gives you the perfect view of everything that's about to change. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.